Welcome, everybody. I'm Bill Sullivan, the professor and director of the Smart Health Communities initiative here on campus. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you and our guest, Ben Hancock, this afternoon to talk about really interesting and wonderful Ohio State University app. Ben is a leader in our industry. He's been a product manager, an analyst. He's a really incredible creative problem solver at Ohio State University. He's got a depth of training and knowledge in mathematics and statistics and the sciences. He's responsible for web and mobile application development at Ohio State, including areas as diverse as financial and HR and student-focused, a bunch of student-focused systems. And of course, we've asked him here to tell us today about the Ohio State University's official mobile app. Ben, I've got like 5 or 6 categories of questions to ask you. The first is to start out and learn a little bit about you. And then I want to kind of take a deep dive into the app. And Bradley tells me that you've got some slides that you might want to show it. And maybe that would be an appropriate time for you to show some slides, and then we can follow up with questions. I've got a set of questions here, and then anybody can write a question in the in chat, and Joe Groans is going to keep his eyes on those and will flag them for me so that we can hear your questions on the fly as well. So let's dig a little deeper into you, Ben. We heard a tiny bit about your background in my introduction, but I want to kind of explore a little bit about how you got into the position that you're in right now. Can you tell us a little bit about your preparation for the job that you have now? How'd you get to Ohio State, and what positions have you held before that? And had you previously developed any apps?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to say hi, Mel. There's at least one person on here that I've known for a long time, so I had to say, hey, what's up? Yeah, so past life, I've kind of been all over the place. I started out working at investment banks, and then after that, I did material science engineering for a little while, and then I came to Ohio State, sort of like life circumstance, and ended up as a product manager on some of the applications that we develop. Prior to the Ohio State app, we had never built a mobile app. So I had never built a mobile app. I had built lots of web apps and lots of sort of like technology solutions, but I had never built a mobile app. So it was a very interesting experience, and lots of learning and a lot of, what would I call it, like confidence building, right? So we did have like a pretty strong belief in what we were doing, and a pretty strong belief in the outcome. But yeah, so very, very diverse background, lots of experience building things, but not necessarily mobile apps. And if there's one thing I've learned from that, it's that mobile is just different. Like the same way, building an app for your desktop is different than building a web application, and you have to sort of learn the environment that you're in. How do we prepare for that? I might ask the same question of everybody here, right? Which is like, what do you do to figure out how you're going to get better at something? And for us, it was really about kind of scouring all the resources that were available. So, the big ones, right? So like the Google, the Apple, the Facebooks, but then also just everybody else who's doing anything similar to this. We're like in a unique position where I think we've built something incredible, like in the Ohio State app, for example, but I don't have a direct competitor, right? So I have no problem sharing literally anything we've done. And I found that everybody else who had made progress in that space in higher education sort of had the same feeling, right? Everybody's willing to share whatever they had done, and lots of good things, but also lots of challenges too.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to learning about those this afternoon. So maybe you can tell us a bit about how it came to pass that you began working on the Ohio State app, and when you started working on it.
Yeah, so we started in 2011, really. it's like fuzzy, right? Because it's been a long time. It was when we started, it was really just a group of people at the university who sort of thought we could do better, right? So it wasn't like the president said to do this or the provost said to do this or even like the CIO or anything said to do this. It was kind of a lot of people who sort of recognized a gap and just decided to like start working on it, right? And we had some leaders around campus who are willing to donate some time to try something out, and then also willing to sort of follow up. Like when we realized, hey, this is a real thing, we're definitely going to do this. They're willing to follow through, which is, when we talk about like journey, it started off as just sort of like we call them like a ragtag group of code bandits or something like that. And I think a big part of that was like we had a bar that we wanted to set, and it was kind of like that consumer bar, right? That Google Apple bar. And you can do that really with like 3 or 4 people. And I think a lot of people have this misconception that you need like 100 people to do that. Over time you do, but to start out, even at places like Apple, which I've learned over the past couple of years, most of their really big impactful things start with like 3 or 4 people, and that's really all you need. But then it kind of like from there it was like, okay, it's a real thing. We presented it to the board of trustees. We had a student who was just like, she was out of this world, like she was brilliant, and she did a great job sort of making all of them feel ridiculous, right, for asking why we needed a mobile app, while they're all like sitting there staring at their phones. And without her, a lot of this was like right place, right time, right people. Without her, it would have been probably gone down a whole different path. But after that, that was our sort of like funding effort, right? So we got funding centrally. And from there, it's just been like a growth cycle, right? Like, okay, so you got the money to sort of like officially do this. Now, how do you do it correctly and sustainably and all of those things?
Good. So we've been talking in our team, and we wondered about the vision that you had. Did it crystallize right from the start, or did it grow and change and evolve over time? And we also noticed that you've got an interesting set of principles that underlie your work. And can you tell us about the vision and how it crystallized or came to be, and then tell us a little bit about those principles?
Yeah, sure. And a lot of this is in the little PowerPoint, and I can share that afterwards. Or we can show it too. Yeah, so I would say the goal hasn't changed, but sort of like how we think we're going to get there has changed over time. So the goal was always the same in the beginning, and it's always been the same, and it's like really, really simple, which is reduce friction for students, right? And that's grown. Like it's not just students anymore, like it's alumni and it's faculty and staff and all sorts of things like that. But the goal was really simple, and it was just reduce friction. And in our case, it was also be like organizationally agnostic is the term we tend to use, right? Like, I don't care if it's student life, I don't care if it's the registrar, like it doesn't matter. If we can reduce friction, we're going to do that. So when you talk about long-term vision, I think there's like a long-term technology vision, which is like make sure that we are on par with expectations and that we're growing in the right direction, which has a lot to do with like, nowadays it's like everything should be hyper personalized, and but a few years ago it was like, oh, is it a watch or is it glasses? So it's just like being on the curve so that you can go with it, because it's infinitely easier to go with the curve than it is to like try and catch up late, after the fact, 5 years after the fact. And we put a lot of effort into that. But our guiding principles, I wonder if anybody here has seen this actually. Like if anybody's met with me on anything, I tend to share these. It's make people's lives easier, deliver useful features over noise, obvious always wins, respond to every single feedback thoughtfully. And I'm like dead serious about that. So like if all of you decide today that you want to go put some feedback in the Ohio State app, every single one of you will get a response. And Chris will be very busy for the next few days, but we respond to every single one everywhere they are. So like on Reddit, on Twitter, and and most often we get submitted directly. And I think a lot of people are scared to engage in that, but it's definitely a skill that a couple people on the team are better at than others. But it's something we take very seriously. And then make the experience more awesome, which really, like, a lot of times we get hung up in these like ROI discussions, which are more of an art form than a science, especially when you're doing something that is supposed to reduce friction. And I could talk about that a little bit, but and then discover, adapt, and reflect. We're always extremely self-critical. Like, everything we do, we're looking at, and it's like, I mean, everybody can sort of experience this. If you just think like, what was that thing I wrote back in high school, right? Or what was that thing I wrote even like 6 months ago? And you're like, that guy was like completely crazy. He had no idea what he was doing, right? We do that pretty regularly. And I think the idea is, if you don't look back and think that you had no idea what you were doing back then, like, your learning has peaked, and you need to start looking for more avenues to learn. And then you can change the university. It's just something, I don't know how it is with Illinois. I know at Ohio State's huge, right? And you guys are big too. It's really easy to get caught up in politics or in like fiefdoms or domains or whatever. It takes a lot of will, like a lot of like organizational will, and then what I'd say is like personal belief to back that up from not a lot of people, like less people than you would think, right? It just takes time, and we've seen that with mobile. We adopted Amazon Web Services, like our team adopted Amazon Web Services, which led to a contract with Ohio State and AWS, which led to a contract with the state of Ohio and AWS, right? Which was not our intent at all, right? Like long term, the intent was just to do the right thing. And then what happened was change. And the same thing with the mobile app in terms of how it sort of changed the incoming student experience. So it's those seven. And yeah,
So let's
we
dig
live by
a
them.
little deeper. Let's dig a little deeper into reduce friction. Tell us give us some examples. What does that mean? Give us some color or concrete examples about that. What friction have you reduced, and how do you identify friction that needs to be reduced?
Yeah. Okay. So that's an interesting one because it's abundant, right? And it's one of those things where, again, there's a bit of an art form to it, and some of it's like, what's sort of the available path, and then what's the right path. So, I'll give you an example. How long does it take for a student to check their schedule? And how do students check their schedule at Illinois, right? Are they logging into something? What are they logging into? How many presses does it take to get to that, right? How much time does that take? That stuff, and that's something that students do very often. I think so. We did the math for one of these, and we use like the weekly classes calendar for that. But if you use Canvas or any of those tools, Canvas is notorious for this, where like it's such a pain in the butt to get to your grades, right? Where if you could just see your grades, that would be great. And then if you really need to do something, you can dig in. But most of the time, you don't really need to do something. Most of the time, you're just like, hey, did my grade get updated? We looked at like screen time for class calendar, and the particular time when we did this, people had viewed the class calendar about 18.5 million times. And if the difference of that was about 20 seconds of checking it in mobile versus checking it in PeopleSoft, which is like very conservative, right? Like realistically, the difference is probably a couple of minutes. That's about 11 years worth of time, like over a calendar year.
20 seconds a pop.
Yeah. Well, and it's easy to just sort of like ignore that. The other thing is, a lot of what we do, we spend a lot of money on resources, like wellness resources, for example, and they're all over campus, but we're not very good about communicating it in a way that people consume them. We're very much organized in the way we spend money, right? So it's like, hey, here's the Department of Psychology's psych clinic, or here's the counseling and consultation services website, right? But like a student's not thinking that. They're thinking like, oh my gosh, I have anxiety, or I think I'm depressed, I need help, right? So we do a lot of abstraction to sort of remove those layers. I think identifying the big ones is pretty easy, but there's so many. It really comes down to like, what kind of things do you think you can have the most impact on? I have like a list of behaviors here that we tend to follow. And like one of them is like pivot when you're stuck, but differentiate when there are hard problems that you need to solve, right? And wellness is an example of like, that was a really hard problem that probably took a year worth of effort to centralize all of that so that we could serve it up in the way necessary to provide it to students. But in other cases, there are lots of equal or similar problems to choose from. And it's really like a who's willing to engage kind of question. But how do you identify those? I think it comes through, like for us now, when we think we've identified one, we usually do a design lab, which is like a 2 or 3 day workshop where we're like proving out the concept. And we go from like story through to like high fidelity, looks like a real app, acts like a real app. Do we actually think this is going to help? But when we started, it was really about like, what are the things people do most often? And sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not. And sometimes you have unintended side effects. So like, we knew wayfinding was a big problem in Ohio State. We didn't know how big of a problem it was. And again, it comes down to that, like, well, we have signs at all the bus stops. That's fine, right? And then we added in like schedules, right, which were like static. And everybody's like, well, how do I know when the bus is coming? So then we added in real-time bus tracking. And this comes down to like, you have to actually look at what people do. Because I as a adult, I always look at the map, right? And I'm like, oh, the bus is there, it's, I have enough time or something. Nobody actually does that. None of the students actually do that, which blew my mind. What they actually do is they look at the bus stop and they say, okay, it's going to be there in 11 minutes because they just expect it to be right. Right. In the same way that they expect their Uber to be right when it shows up. And when you talk about reducing friction, in some cases, we introduced friction, right? Because those services were off by up to 1.5 minutes, which you can imagine if a bus is coming, that's a big problem. Once we realized that and figured out what was going on, like they re-implemented the bus system and they improved the timings, and all of this stuff happened as a result of that. But had we never gone down that road, none of those improvements would have been made. It'd still be like 1.5 minutes because it wasn't ever really being used until we put it in front of somebody.
Students can now use the OSU app. They can they're someplace close to a bus stop and they can look and see what time the bus will get there. The next bus will get there. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, we have the capacity to do that. We haven't done it yet. That's and what you're saying is it's a highly used feature.
It's top 5. Wayfinding, yeah, wayfinding, and like I put buses and buildings in the same category because usually it's like how do I get from point A to point B? And when you talk like long term, our ideal is we'll just tell you what to do. But there's some hurdles to that require a lot of work that we're kind of trying to figure out still. Like to do that meaningfully, we have to send all the info to Google.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, you have what are your top 5? And can you give us some metrics on what does that mean to be in the top 5?
Let me pull it up here real quick. I'll give you top 5 as of today. How about that?
Great.
As Google's Data Studio loads. Yeah, so, okay, so About You, which is the screen that you log into. If anybody wants to view any of this stuff, by the way, if you download the Ohio State app, you can log in. The username is student and the password is Ohio State. You'll get, obviously, all the information's fake. But if you want to see what it looks like when a student's logged in, we don't require students to log in to use this stuff. So there's like a differentiation between authenticated and non-authenticated. So top 5 right now, About You, campus, which includes like buildings and buses, is number 2. The Carmen calendar, which is like a calendar of your assignments. It's not like a class schedule calendar. It's like a calendar of what you have coming due. The weekly calendar, which is your class schedule, and then Buck ID transactions, which are payment transactions for like your like meal plan or your cash that you're spending in local dining and stuff like that. So those are the top 5 right now. What that means is in a month, that might mean like, I'm looking at 30 days, I think right now, that might mean like between 500,000 and 1 million views. In a year, it's between like 5 million and 25 million, something like that. So when you talk about like friction, it's when you know something's being looked at 20 million times, it's worth it to spend like a few weeks looking at one screen because you know it's going to be viewed 20 million times, right? And we've done that a lot. I think about a fourth of our year, roughly, every year is spent on just refactoring. So
tell us a little bit about wayfinding. What underlies it? Do you use Google Maps, or how does it work?
So we tried to use Google Maps one time, which is a funny story. And I don't know how your campus is laid out, but not all of our buildings are like readily accessible by street. So the address in Google Maps and the location wasn't as reliable as you would want it to be. So we actually sent a lot of people to the wrong place, which was kind of a funny, that lasted for about an hour, by the way. But what we have is like, we have a space information management system that's managed by our real estate group, and we've integrated with that. So we have like latitude and longitude of all of the buildings, right? As well as all of the amenities that those buildings have. So like, do they have gender inclusive restrooms? Do they have prayer spaces? Do they have accessible entrances? And those are things that they didn't have before that they've added as a result of us asking, which is kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking like 600 buildings or whatever. So that's one data layer. The other is like real-time bus information. And then we just use whatever map is native to the platform. So if it's Google, it'll show up on Google Maps. And if it's Apple, it'll show up on Apple Maps. But the data layers are coming from us. We tried to use like throw in addresses and get it back from Google Maps or Apple Maps, but to mixed results. So space information has been and building information has been our best source.
Tell us also about the calendar. Sounds very interesting. And what goes in the calendar, and how do things get populated? And tell us also about, well, I have a follow-up question about events, but help us understand the calendar, and what do you scrape to get in the calendar, or how is it personalized for those of us who have different schedules?
Sure. So the assignment stuff is really easy, right? I would say that's like the easiest part because there's a single point of entry for that in most cases, and it's for us it's Canvas.
So everybody uses Canvas.
Pre-pandemic, that was very not true. I think it was like 60-40 or something, and now it's closer to like 90-10. There are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, especially for undergraduate students, the assignments show up in Canvas. There are a whole bunch of different calendars on campus. I would say probably thousands. And we have picked those, the ones in addition to like class related. So class comes from ERP, like PeopleSoft, right? Assignments comes from Canvas. Those are pretty set sources. And then we sort of bring in other things. So we bring in like events, and we bring in like reservations. So like if you make a library reservation, that'll show up in your calendar. But those events, that like all of the other stuff that happens is managed in a whole bunch of different places. Like student life, I think alone probably has like 20 different sources of calendars. And we created a single format and we integrate with that format. So anybody can integrate if they want to, but there's a few that are on our like have to have list, right? Which are like a couple of the big student life ones, our student union, obviously like the athletic schedules, those things as they get integrated are sort of like opt in, opt out. Like you can see what you want, you know what I mean? Like you can pick what you want to see or not see. There's a few different calendar spaces. I wouldn't say we've solved, I would say like on the, as a student, we've solved the calendar problem, but I would say is like as a student plus extracurriculars, we haven't really solved the problem fully yet. And it probably bears like more deep work. But it's one of those ones like, we end up being the source of the truth when this happens, because we consolidate so much information. And when you do that, you really have to be prepared to be willing to do that. So for like wellness, we went in with this saying like, hey, like we need 2 more developers to be able to, and a person actually managing the content to be able to sustain this longer than a year. And we don't want to do it if you don't want to sustain it longer than a year, regardless of like how important it is, like politically or whatever. I think calendars maybe not that big, but it'd be pretty big.
How does a student not get 5,000 things a day on their calendar?
So they have to opt in.
Yeah,
right?
they opt in
And
for
that,
everything they want. And
yeah,
can they
that kind of,
switch? Can they look at what's happening at the union or in athletics or in their class assignments?
yeah, generally we do those like, so like we try to keep the student stuff separate from the extracurricular stuff usually. But generally that stuff is location based if they haven't opted into something, right? So you can look at stuff that's around you. And that sort of like filters. And again, I don't think that's like the correct solved way to do this. It's just kind of like our sort of like mid measure at the moment.
So
I can't, somebody asked, can I fix my calendar so I don't have 5,000 meetings? I can fix that. It's like really easy. You just don't accept them, right? And you start with just a day. So for us, it's Thursdays. We don't get any meetings on Thursdays. Nobody accepts a meeting on Thursday. And then you just work from there. You just like grow it as, you know, I'm actually serious about that, by the way.
No meetings on Thursday?
None, 0. Got to work sometime, right?
Yeah, right. That's probably a good idea, actually. Sandeep asks, how do you ensure that users see events that are coming up on campus that are most relevant to them first?
Yeah, okay. So in the For You section of the app, so there's events and then there's sort of like content, and sometimes they like overlap and it's not super clear. And again, there's actually like a redesign happening right now that'll come out in June that solves some of this. But that section and the For You section in the app changes based on what we know about you to a degree, right? And it is updated every week, right? So, and there's a content manager who takes in all of the content from around campus, like, and all of our regional campuses. So in Ohio, it's like Newark and Marion and a few others that range in size. Some are small, some are pretty big. And based on what we know about your enrollment and what your current status is, we show you content. So like right now, the dimensions, there are a lot of dimensions, but not nearly enough to be really great at this, right? So like we know if you're a transfer student, we know if you're a campus change student, we know if you're undergraduate or graduate, we know what a midterm relative you are. So like if you've been at Ohio State for 3 years or you've been for 2 years or, you know, et cetera. We know what campus you're on. Obviously, like whether you're staff, faculty, student, or just student, because a lot of the content is geared towards people who also don't work here. So we have dimensions for all of that. And in the same vein as the calendar vein, we try to show them only the things that we that we think they need to see. And I would err on the side of somebody missing something than overwhelming them. And the same is true for notifications, actually. Like people love to send, everybody wants to send like a push notification for something.
Right.
Because we have so many of the students in the app. And that's just not like, even if you cut it down, you're going to do too much. If you're doing more than once a month or once every couple of weeks and it's not actually relevant to them, you are like way out of line and they'll just turn it off.
So how do you deal with it?
Yeah, depends on the circumstance. Typically I just say no. But like when people request it, typically I just say no. But there are a lot of cases for times when we need to do them and have them be appropriate. And there's just rules around it that we've created. So like if you want to send a push notification to a population of students, we need to know all of the students. When you actually need to have a content item written for that. And then there's a pretty high bar that you have to meet, right? So it's not like even like a university-wide event from the president does not meet the bar. Like it has to have an impact on their tangible impact on their education. Like there's a few criteria. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but like we've done push notifications for things like DACA and other things that were like going to genuinely impact a student's ability to attend school. We don't do fluffy ones, which is a choice. I think there's probably a place for some fluffy ones, but you have to have somebody who's like really in tune with the students to be able to do that and have it not come off as like, here's a letter from the president, right? That nobody wants to read and is in super formal language, which happens,
Constantly.
all across the university, right? So that's how we sort of protect the students from that and also protect ourselves from it. But I won't say it's easy. Like that's one of the most, and in our case, we have like 96-97% of the students are logged into the app. So like, people view it as a channel to like get their message out, which is great. But we also opt into all of those that aren't emergency alerts. So you don't automatically get any of them unless you opt in. So we've, it's maybe like anti-marketing, anti-communications, but we treat privacy the same way.
So I guess I want to follow up on the privacy question comment, but first I want to ask, are there services that you considered that you've thought, you know what, let's keep doing this. Let's not do this in the mobile environment. It should be in some other environment. Have you made decisions about that? In other words, is there content that's better served not on mobile, or is pretty much everything these days relevant to mobile?
Yeah, so I think that's like a little bit of a loaded question, because I think our opinions about that have changed, but it has more to do with our capability, like our skills, and our time than it does whether it's the correct thing to do or not. And an example is, like my wife lives on her iPad. She does not own a laptop, right?
Oh.
Doesn't own one. So if she doesn't have something that works on mobile, it doesn't work for her. Without using just a web browser. And I used to feel that way about sufficiently complicated things, right? So like you're scheduling your classes, that's sufficiently complicated. We've avoided stuff like that just because of the effort required relative to the return on frequency, right? Like you're checking your calendar every day, you're riding the bus every day, you're scheduling 2 or 3 times a year, right? I think it belongs on mobile, but I think it's probably a ways off in our current environment, because there are things that are sufficiently complicated that it would be really hard to do in mobile well enough to justify it being there. And for us, like I would rather not do it than like do it poorly. So we've made a lot of those kinds of decisions.
Great, thank you. Let's. I want to talk about design, but first, let's talk first about privacy. Since you brought that up, you indicated earlier that you could sign into the app without actually being a student, that suggests that you don't have to be authenticated. And I wonder what are the gradations that you've got, and what kind of choice to give people about the data that are collected, and what data do you collect, and what controversies have you been burned in effigy for any of this stuff?
Yeah, well, so in our case, we're probably very conservative when it comes to that. So we don't require anybody to log into the app. So if you load the Ohio State app, you can use any of the unauthenticated features, right? And that's on purpose, right? So if you're a visitor on campus, say you're visiting your kids, or you're visiting, you're a alumni and you haven't been here in 20 years and there's no way you're logging in, but you want to figure out where Mount Hall is or something, like, you should be able to find a bus or a building, right? There's literally no reason to put that behind authentication. And then as I say that, I've had an argument about safety reasons to put that behind authentication, right? In terms of like gathering spaces and things like that. But in the end, the right thing to do is to make that available to everyone, because there are other means for them to find out publicly.
What about choices about enabling location services or Bluetooth on your device? Do you ask? I mean, you have to ask permission now,
yep.
right?
Yep. And
so how does that work?
Yeah, so generally we ask, and we're always aiming for, so if you're hooked up to a watch and you're using your watch navigation, I think somebody asked earlier, like, how does some of the wayfinding work? You can put in you can say, take me to my next class, and it'll like give you directions using whatever native wayfinding you have. If you're hooked up to your watch, generally you end up with like an always on setting. But usually what we want is on while you're in the app. Because while I have a lot of location data about a lot of people, there's not like we've used it for research studies and things like that in the past, but whenever we did that, we gathered explicit consent to use it for that. Right now, the only thing we tell people we're using it for, and the only thing we actually use it for, is troubleshooting, right? Like, we have performance issues and things like that in certain locations, but we don't do. We kind of err on the side of caution, because it's really easy to gather lots of data. It's really hard to make decisions based on data, and we have enough decisions to make without like throwing in the location mix. Now, our transportation group, for example, is very interested in the data, but they have other ways to gather that information. So we've kind of like been on the fence. We allow anyone to opt out of anything that they want. Obviously, if they don't turn location services on, they don't work. When people do that, we default to certain locations. So if we know you're a Columbus student, we default to like the Ohio Stadium. If we know you're a Newark student, we default to the Central Newark building. And then you can still use the services, right? You can still use the bus finding and stuff like that. It just won't show you exactly where you are. And we won't ever get like a message back in the log saying, hey, you're at latitude 38, longitude 38, or whatever. And that's like a personal thing. I will say, when we've talked to students about this, they've cared a lot less than we do. Like, we're very, very sensitive to it, but I've talked to hundreds of students at this point about it. And we even did like a focus group study, and basically they were like, yeah, we don't care. As long as you tell us what it is, and as long as it's not something bad, like, we could care less. Which makes me even more cautious about it, unfortunately, I think, because then there's no line, right? Like, it's a constant request that we get, and one that we've been very conservative about. So maybe that'll change in the future.
Is there a way to drive additional innovation in the app through some combination of working with kind of privacy and consent, identity and security engineering?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you want to, like, what innovation means in those particular domains. Like, for us, it's more of a design question than it is like an innovation question. Like, okay, a great example is like identity. you're making a very big design decision by making everyone identify themselves when they log in, right? And you're making a huge design decision by requiring them to do that before they can do anything else, right? So what is innovation in that case, right? Like for me, innovation is understanding where that's appropriate and where it's not. And how do you move forward the goal of the people who are using the app, not our goal, and still protect those things, right? We actually did a like sort of related, unrelated. We built a thing called C for You, or cybersecurity for you, that we've integrated with the mobile app, and it's like short, funny story related security things. I know probably not what you meant, but like short, funny story related things that we use as like outreach to the students in order to get them to help protect themselves more. But that's sort of like an aside. We can talk about that some other time if you want.
Good. Let's move to design. Tell us a little bit about the design process that you're engaged in, how you identify features, and tell us a little bit about your design team, and what's a typical research and design process look like?
Yeah, sure. Actually, can I screen share real quick? I think that might be the easiest way to do this.
Sure.
We'll see if this how this works. Hey, I can still see you. Unfortunately, you get to see yourself at the top right there, Bill.
So can you go full screen?
Yeah, I will. Oh, we can hide you. Yeah, so let me go back a little bit. Yeah, so I'll jump through this real quick and see if there's anything we didn't cover. I'll cover this real quick before we get to design. And this is why design is so important. And I kind of alluded to it when we talked about bus screens and calendar screens. These are stats for a year. So a little over 240,000 users, around 65 million views, and about 260,000 article views. This is around 40% of all sort of like content traffic at Ohio State. So like osu.edu, for example, like the home page is around 6 or 7 million views a year. And then all of the sub pages, like all 900,000 websites at Ohio State, are around 100 million views total. So it's important to understand, like when you're designing, the impact that you could have potentially. And when you get to this level of adoption, the scale changes a little bit, and like little things can make a huge difference. And this is actually down, and that's a success. So I think last year was like 72 million, and we reduced it to 65 million by sort of hiding a few things, things that nobody sort of cared about, or were needless friction. And we've gone down, and that's positive, which is, if you were at like an outside company talking about traffic, you would never, ever do that. Like, even if it were the right thing to do, you wouldn't do it. So I think, as you guys go down your mobile journey, keep in mind that you'll have the opportunity to make decisions like that may look worse numbers wise, but are better experience wise. And at the bottom right, go to osu.edu/Ohio State App 2021. There's probably 2017, 2018, 2019. There is no 2020. You guys can read into that however you want. And 2021, like sort of like mini infographics that we do every year, just to cover some of the things that we're working on. That's how we started, guiding principles. Yeah, so this is where you get into design stuff. And this has to do with behaviors a lot. I put this picture on here, and I think I took this from Luke W. If you follow him on Twitter, or if you don't, you probably should. He's a Google designer, and one of the places I look to for like unique insights into problems that are sort of irrelevant to higher education, but still relevant. We're really good. Universities really good at doing the top step, like really, really good. Like if you've ever been in a meeting about like academic schedules or something like that, like you go from like, oh, we understand this, to like, here are the 87 different variations. in like 5 minutes or something. What we're not great at is the second step. And that's kind of what we've tried to focus our skills on. There's nothing, I think we mentioned pretty much everything here. The only thing, yeah, the only things I would really point out here, like products over projects. So like for us, everything is long-term. There's no such thing as short-term, right? So there's no like, we're going to put a site up or we're going to put a screen up, because once I've delivered it to somebody's phone, I can't take it off. And I, technically I could, but it's a very bad experience for something to randomly disappear. And then developers are always in the room, and really we talk about making like intentional decisions, even when we know they're not the best decision. So like the calendar example is one that I would use for the intentional decision. We had to decide whether we put in an okay version or whether we didn't put it in it at all. And a lot of times we'll just not put it in at all. And in that case, we said like, okay, we're going to put this in. Design process. So I would say it's matured a lot in the past few years. This is a picture of like 2011 old Android phone all the way through 2021. And you can see like some things have stayed the same and some things have changed. And you can see some design elements, like things that faded out over time, like gradients and stuff like that. And really, to me, for anybody who's going to go down this journey, the key is that you are going to continuously redesign these things. Like it's never done. There's no such thing as done. And you have to be looking at it constantly. And for us now, the small things we do all of the time. So anytime you're touching something, you're looking at the design of it. But the big things, what we tend to do is get like a cross-functional group together and do a design lab. It's usually, between 2 and 4 days. And we go through a pretty set process, which is like a day in the life and covering pain points that people have, which is sort of like definition of the problem. And then we do whiteboards, which look like the app, right? But are a whiteboard version, and we get feedback on that. And then we do high fidelity designs, and then we get feedback on that. And we do all of that in 2 or 3 days, and with whoever the partners are that have a vested interest in this. So we did it with wellness. We're actually doing one in about 2 weeks with our university's DEI and J task force, because they want to make sure that there are features there that support everybody at the university. And they spend a lot of resources, again, trying to improve the experience for our DEI and J community. And a lot of times those things go unnoticed. So we're going to be looking at like how we can improve that. But we get all of those people together, for 3 or 4 days, and we come out with what pretty much looks like the final product. And there's a lot of reasons we do that. A lot of it has to do with like willing partnership, and like if somebody's too busy to take a couple days to do this, you probably don't want to be doing this with them. There's a lot of like practical reasons to do that too. But it's also great just to like break everybody's cycle of, meeting every day at 3 o'clock kind of thing, and let people be creative. Yeah, so this is 2011, 2021. These are some other views just so you can get an idea. So all of these have iPad partners. There's also the Apple Watch or the Apple Watch app. And then when you talk about design for things that don't exist, we tend to try and explore all of these things. The right-hand side's a Mac app, so you can download the iOS 8 app on your MacBook if you have one. This was some machine learning parking stuff that we were working on. Like one of the big questions is like, are you allowed to park here or not? And it changes constantly depending on what time of day it is, and making that easier for people. We never actually got to like an interface stage, but we got it to work. But we didn't really see the use case. And then we've done some work with AR, and not so much with VR, but quite a bit of AR stuff. And again, a lot of that ended up being like pretty fluffy, to the point that it's not really ready for prime time. But we want to know how to do it when it is ready for prime time, right? So if some form of phone or device comes out that you're able to do this and it not be disruptive to like how you're navigating, we want to be able to meet them there immediately. And the AR one, this is one of our developers' kids. But one of the things we did was put those tooltips for the buildings, like, you know, does this have a gender inclusive restroom? Does this have a dining hall or whatever over the building? So like if you swung your phone around campus, like you could see where those things were. There were problems with that, which were pretty funny. Like over time, it forgets where you are, like it forgets where like true zero is. So then, you know, it sort of drifted over time. So until they solve that hardware problem, we can't solve the software problem, but it's more about like being ready. So that's kind of our design. The design lab is really the core of our big project now, but the other part, a lot of it just has to do with culture and always looking for improvements. So that's the big part of that.
Have you done any work on gamification, thinking about how you might use some of the psychological tools of gaming that engage us so well to serve your users?
Yeah. Let me see if I can bring something up. Hold on. So not so much for mobile. Well, so we have done it for mobile, but it's always been like a feel good thing, not necessarily a behavior change thing. So the cybersecurity for you thing that I mentioned is more like behavior change, like get people to take security training without knowing they're taking security training with funny YouTube videos. But in the mobile side, like we've done some like scavenger hunt work where like you could go to the like Ohio Stadium and there would be something there for you to learn about Ohio Stadium. And we did that as part of orientation. It was like a sort of like a get to know Ohio State kind of thing. And you got a score based on how many of the things that you found. Like some of them, it would tell you where to go, and some of them it wouldn't tell you where to go. I think it's very cool, but it's a very expensive thing to upkeep because it loses sort of like the new feel immediately. And you like see this in like, and just games in general, how some of them have staying power and some of them like it's super popular. Like what was the bird thing? Not Angry Birds, but the other one that was like super punishing. I don't know what it's called, like Flappy Birds. And it was like super popular for like 3 days and then it was gone. And like, so you have to, if you're going to do something like that, you have to really be committed to, or just know, like if you're going to do it for, 50 days for orientation and then drop it after that, you can do that. Or if it's going to be like a true part of what you're doing, I think it would be cool. Somebody
I want
asked,
to ask about,
oh, go ahead.
There's a couple questions here that focus on the design lab. One is how frequently are they, and are they always forward looking, or do you actually use them to kind of understand usability testing, bring people back and explore what's working, what hurdles exist, what confusion exists?
Yeah, the frequency changes. So like during the summer when we're redoing iOS and Android stuff for the next release, they don't really happen at all. But in the fall and spring, it's like once every few weeks and it's exhausting. So we try not to do them more frequently than that. Like spending all day for a few days, because for like, usually it involves some sort of performance, right? So like either we're writing user stories or we're doing whiteboards or we're doing high fidelity. And usually that's when you're not talking to people. So after 5 o'clock or after 6 o'clock, right? Like, so for us, those are very taxing. So like at most every few weeks, but usually it's like when something rises to the level of needing that. And how that relates to like, those are typically forward looking, but I've not done one that hasn't had impacts on the current application as a whole. So like if we go into this DEIJ design lab, and one of the things that we're missing is showing someone how to find a resource, or like a mental health resource or something like that. We might have to redesign everything to fit that in, right? And it's a importance decision, but we'll do that during the design lab. We won't wait. And then usability testing, we do varying levels of that at varying frequencies. So we do some, I would say like, maybe that's the wrong way to say it, like different formality levels, right? So we tend to try and look at what people actually do through analytics the most, because that's the easiest. And then the actual usability part in the lab happens with the high fidelity section, right? Which is like, here's what the high fidelity looks like. You know, okay, so we've come up with a thing, but they haven't actually touched it yet. That usually happens through some form of like beta rollout, right? So that's it kind of varies quite a bit. But somebody asked how many people are at a design lab. Typically, it's between about 10 and 20. And our supporting cast is about 4 people. So it's usually like 2 people facilitating, and then 2 people doing design and writing user stories the whole time. So it's like a serious commitment. That's why when the partners and the other groups that need to show up, like if they're not willing to show up, it's okay to just not. We just won't do the thing. We'll go do something else that's equally important.
You mentioned analytics as a key part of your trying to understand your user experience. And then do you use Splunk, or do you use Google, or what are your analytic tools?
All of the above. It's we have, I would say Google Analytics is what we use most frequently. And we have like, I don't know, Chris is up to like 40 or 50, something like that, different analytics pages that he has put together. But then we also have Splunk and AWS CloudWatch that are like when we really need to dig into behavior, like when we really, really need to dig in, but usually the surface level stuff is Google Analytics. Back to the usability thing, one of the things we try to do is rely really heavily on people who have done much more usability testing than we could ever do. And one of the examples are like Google's designs or Apple's design standards and Google's material design. Like I really, really recommend looking at those and really, like if you're gonna do something, really understand why they say what they say, especially if you're gonna deviate from it. And some of it is like, yeah, it's just, we won't ever, as Ohio State, ever be able to put the resources in to test. We have like 280 screens in the app, which is absurdly large, right? We won't ever be able to test all of those screens usability wise, right? So we have to really, really rely on some of the big standards. And I'll give you an example. Like if you've ever seen like a card on a website, like, you know, like you mouse over the card and it like does like a cool flip animation, never do that, right? It's really cool. I thought it was really cool anyway, but never do that, because hiding information is bad, right? And hiding information behind an action is even worse, right? But like, you know, they spent time to research that, and then they also give you like good examples of how to appropriately do this. And the science from them is always changing on it. So it's something that we keep a pretty close eye on. We also do serious accessibility testing. Like all of our mobile stuff is, you can never say 100%, but I would say like 99% accessible, which is something we, for a lot of reasons, we take very seriously.
Yeah, sure, good. So a little bit about development. What languages do you write in?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to share my screen again. I think I have something in here, just so you can see. Yeah, so this is a little bit old, but this kind of gives you an idea of what the what the technology is. The server side, which handles like all of the cleanup, like everything that comes to us goes through a transformation layer, and it's all in node.js. It was all on premise. I would say now it's like 30% on premise, 70% AWS, and we're just like gradually moving towards the AWS direction. The actual app itself is native. It's, in this case, it's Swift and Kotlin. If that gives you an idea of refactoring, I think Kotlin was released like 4 years ago or something, and Swift like 5 years ago. We have rewritten the app language, like we have 100% rewritten the app. So there's no Objective-C and there's no Java. In the one thing I would say is, so we're a native shop, quote unquote. There are a lot of, like when we first started, there were a lot of like hybrid tools. Like I would say React Native is the closest now to like a really good hybrid tool that lets you sort of like do all of it at once. At the time, what that meant was, and I always use this example, what the time that meant was, okay, you have a Java problem and a Swift problem, and now you're adding a React problem or a third-party problem. Nowadays, I think it's a little different. I think the hybrid apps are much, much better than they ever were before. And they're a lot easier to distribute and a lot easier to update. But that comes at a cost, right? Like you can't adopt features as fast. But this is like current state. Again, if I showed you this picture like 6 years ago or something, the API layer was all PHP, which was a mistake because it was not asynchronous. And then the app layer, I'm like pointing at my screen, you guys can't see what I'm pointing at, but the app layer was all Objective-C and Java. So I think the native decision for us was really good. And it's really good if you want to be an early adopter of like Apple features and Google features. And where I would have said never do hybrid like 6 years ago, I think now it's a perfectly reasonable option to use something like React Native. But whenever you go into that, I would say do a lot of research. But those are the general technology stacks.
How do you deal with sending? Do you try to do everything native in the app, or do you send people off to websites on campus? And how do you deal with Apple's new requirements that people have to opt in for tracking, which is an incredibly loaded term that scares a lot of people?
Well, so the opting in for tracking hasn't really bothered us at all, actually, because I don't depend on it for ad revenue. It's bothered the medical center quite a bit more here at Ohio State because they use that tracking to sort of judge the efficacy of their advertising. So they would like do an advertising thing with a special ID in it, and then people who downloaded the app through that ID would then be attributed to that. So they would know like, hey, we spent $30,000 and it was 2,000 users or something like that, whatever the numbers are. But we actually, it hasn't impacted us at all.
Not in terms of advertising, but in terms of serving your users. So a user wants to gain access to some feature that's not native, and you point them to an external website, and they haven't opted in for that. How does that impact their experience?
So I can't say we've seen an impact. Typically, so to your like philosophical question, which is like, how do we treat it? Generally, if someone comes to us and they want something in the app, we are putting it in the app natively. Like if you come to us and say you want to show traffic alerts, we're not including a link to your traffic alert website typically, right? For things that are going to persist. But in the content section, we have a lot of stuff that links out externally, and it hasn't stopped any of it from working. Now, are there impacts that I don't know about? Maybe, but it hasn't really disrupted what we're doing. I think you really have to be into the advertising IDs for it to have created a serious problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've dealt with the med center side of the problem quite a bit, and it's definitely been some heartache for them.
So how easy is, given this organization that you're showing us here, how easy is it to build a new capability into the app or a new functionality? How long does it take, and what's that development process like for you?
It kind of depends on size. So like when we did the traffic alerts recently, and it was like 8 weeks start to finish, I want to say. But it's usually dependent on size, and I should say like partner maturity. So like our layer, like as you can see, like we treat all of these things as like individual data sources that come in, and we do whatever, transformation we need to do, and then we put it in the form that the app needs to see it in, right? So that part is actually not bad. I mean, assuming the APIs work, it's like 2 or 3 weeks tops. Usually the problem is like quality of data from the source systems, and then the maturity of the team who manages the source system to create an API. But if you told me like, I want to put in a new Canvas feature, which has a very mature API, and you want to do that, 3 weeks from now, I'd say that's probably possible. So in most cases, not very long, but usually the limiting factor is our data infrastructure, not necessarily the development time on the team. And the same goes for priorities. A lot of people think like, hey, you have 800 things waiting for you, which we do. But the limiting factor for that isn't like app developer time. The limiting factor is the work that's going to have to go in. If you told me you needed a PeopleSoft integration, I would be like, okay, so we're talking like 2 months or something, right? Like the team that we're dealing with changes the timeline pretty drastically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk just briefly about Canvas. So Canvas has its own app. So why would you take the time to invest in recreating some Canvas experiences in the Ohio State app?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question, and that's actually true. You could ask that question like maybe like 30 times in the things that we manage, and that in itself is the answer, right?
Yeah,
which is there is a Canvas app, right? There's a
bus app.
Yep, there's it's Clever doesn't have it, but Double Map does. There's all of these things, right? And then where it sort of falls apart is like, okay, so there are 30 of them. How am I going to know what I need and what to do, right? And for us, we don't tend to like replace the Canvas app, for example, or replace the buses app, for example. We want a layer into that that's going to be just easy to see at the surface level, right? And it goes back to like the problems that are too hard to solve here or not, or should be solved here or not. Like it's a thing where like, yeah, scheduling would be great in here, but our goal really is to reduce friction. And the way we're reducing friction right now is making it easy for people to find things, not by replacing really heavy operational tasks. We replace some operational tasks, like people fill out SEIs in their phone, and some other things like, or student evaluations on their phone and some other things. But generally speaking, we want to provide a more simple experience than those places by like a long shot. And right, so if you're a student and you go to the Canvas app, what you'll never see is a bus, right? What you'll never see is a dining hall, right? And that's not right now, and that this could change, right? Right now, that is not indicative of your life as a student, because those things are pretty intertwined at the information level.
Yeah. Nick wants to know if you deep link to the Canvas app.
For things that we can, yes. But we don't, again, I go back to this, like, I don't want to send someone to a bad experience, right? So I try to create the best experience I can so that they don't need to do that. Some like deep linking to an app requires that whoever created that app to have like smart URLs, right? Which can either open it on web if they have the app or open the app. And not many have that, right? So in a lot of cases, we don't link to them at all. We just have the surface level information there. And if they want to go get the Canvas app, they can. And I really encourage any other things that have apps. I don't say don't do that, right? I want all of those experiences to get better, because if the Canvas app experience is better, that transition is better, right? Like all of that becomes easier if they get better. But it doesn't do away with the need for a central place to get the information, which is a pretty common, it's been like a recurring conversation. And when we were talking about going to Workday before that was canceled, it was like, well, the Workday app will do this. And you ask the question like, okay, so does the Workday app have buses? Does it have Canvas? Does it have dining? And it's like, well, no, but right. And then you're like, okay, so it doesn't actually do this. It does the things Workday does, which is really important. Like it needs to do those things and it needs to do them well, but just a different goal. And
good.
philosophy,
we appreciate that answer. Yeah, we appreciate that answer. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to kind of step back and say, if you could share with us, 3 or 4 big lessons, or even 2 or 3 big lessons that you've learned, what would you share with us?
That's an interesting question. I think the number one thing for me would be to get those big things right. Like if I were going to create an app right now from scratch, I would, and you can ask me for this, I can send it to you. I would look at the top things that people are going to use, and it's going to be different from your environment. So somebody's going to have to translate, right? Like, is this relevant here or not? But I would try and get those 5 or 6 things really right. We did that, but we were just lucky, right? Like, and there was some skill involved and stuff like that, but I would attribute that to like luck because of how immature we were at the time. It would be to get those 5 things right. The second would be a lot of people are going to not understand why this is important. And I felt that like at the administrative level as we were going through this journey, like a lot of people who, and again, maybe this has changed and, maybe now people realize, but ROI on experience is really hard to explain to people, right? And it's why I use the calendar example of like 11 years of time. You need a really compelling story in order to convince them. And that's one of the reasons we do the design labs, is because it's really good at producing like a continuous compelling story. And people buy into that story better than I thought they would. Like it's like the danger of like the power like this power of one or whatever you want to call it, that one story is really high, but it's also really strong. Like the reason it's dangerous is because it works. And I would like work really hard to get a good story around how this is going to change people's lives, right? Like when we started, we didn't know that like they would remove all of the bus signage and they would never hand out maps again, right? And like we didn't know any of that stuff, but a lot of that you can sort of like predict now based on your experiences with other things, like just other interactions on your phone, whether it's Google Maps or something like that. Like when's the last time somebody printed on MapQuest or something? And then I guess the other would be you can choose how much of a problem decentralization is for you, or silos. Like data problems are one of our biggest problems. And it's because everybody thinks they're an owner of the data, right? Like I'm sure many people here feel like they own some part of some data. And outside of those big 5 or 6 things that you really, really need to push through, everything else is optional, right? And the only thing you're going to do is improve the experience, which is great. It gives you the option to just stop when you hit a wall, right? And just go a different direction. And a lot of people look at the silos and they're like, that's awful. We're never going to be able to do this because it's all siloed. And I'm looking at it, and I would encourage you guys to look at it and say, like, that's awesome. Like, okay, like, you know, if Bill doesn't want to work with me, I know Mel will. So like, let's go talk to Mel and do Mel's stuff. And one of the things I have on that behavior slide is like, critical mass has gravity, right? Which is like, if you get big enough, like if you get the user base to a really good place, yeah, it went from like us like begging people to share stuff with us to like my list of to-dos, like our roadmap is like eternal, right?
Yeah.
And 100% full all the time, which is great. It's never
So what are
110% full.
What are those 5 sources of data that you think are really critical? What are the 3 to 5 really critical pieces?
Yeah, like think like core to experience being a student. I would say like whatever dining system, like whatever Buck ID, we call it Buck ID, but it's like Blackboard, like you put dollars on it and you spend it for dining and stuff like that. I think that's a huge one. We actually added a digital version of that recently, which is kind of cool. That's a big one. ERP for a few things. So like grades, statement of account, calendar, right? We also have holds because obviously students want to know when they can't schedule. And that's one of our famous, like, you hit a brick wall stories was with like not holds, but to-dos. And we have rules, like we never use acronyms, and the whole thing was an acronym, like everything was an acronym, and nobody was willing to clean it up, right? So we just didn't do it. And then we go back later and they're like, yeah, we really need to add these. And it's like, okay, so we can't have acronyms. Do we clean them up now? So the ERP, and then the wayfinding stuff is going to be a mix of like buildings, buses, whatever sort of transportation methods you have around, and then amenities for those buildings. The content part, like the article, the news article, the relevant content to students, stuff like that, it's important, but it's not in the top 5. It's not in the list of have to have things, even though a lot of even though it's very good for marketing and communications reasons, it's not required. We didn't have it until 3 years ago. It's become very important, right? But it's not hard required for you to have the adoption. And then I would put Canvas in the list. Like Canvas is absolutely required. And then some sort of search. And you can experience that. But those are the big ones off the top of my head.
Let's take one last question here, and this is from Vanessa. And she asks, how do you communicate boundaries with content creation and management?
Okay, so I think boundaries just in general with any of this stuff is really challenging, right? So if I'm putting statement of account in the mobile app, the bursar has a vested interest in how I do that, right? Like they're going to really care whether I list the fees first or the tuition first, right? Like they really care about that, as I've learned. And that goes to like, the same is true about any content that's going in, whether it's content that exists statically or content that's like a content article that comes from like a marketing group, right? For the marketing group stuff, we have a person whose job it is to manage that. They have a schedule, they have themes that they run. It's all year long and it changes based on the time of year. For the static stuff, it's a little harder. And what I'll say is, you really need a strong personality to be a product manager for what you're doing, right? Someone who has the authority or believes they have the authority to ignore whatever request, regardless of who it's coming from, right? Because at some point, like you have to make hard decisions. And like, the registrar asking me to rearrange how things are listed, to me is like, okay, fine. Yeah, that's an easy decision. But there are plenty that are like, this is a mobile platform, and someone has to really understand the difference between this and their website that they've had for 20 years, right? And understand that there's a difference, right? Just appreciate that there's a difference, and really work on that. So that's the boundary drawing for us. Is we have taken ownership, like, and I say we, but it's really Chris. He's the product manager for the mobile app, and he is the gospel, right? So it doesn't matter if it's the president or the provost or the CIO. It doesn't matter. Like, if Chris says it's stupid, it's stupid. And it's not that we aren't like confrontational about it, but we expect everyone to have a conversation with us, right? Like, we're very mindful, and I've had plenty of situations where somebody has convinced me that I'm completely wrong and I don't know what I'm talking about. Like safety is one of those ones where we're like, the language you're using for safety is just doesn't match anything that we're doing, and it's really bad. And then they're like, here's why we do it. And I'm like, oh, well, clearly I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Like, we need to do that. But you have to have somebody who has both the sort of like stubbornness to say no, but then the willingness to take ownership of that. To that point, we don't have like a governance committee. We do have some advisory groups that help us in topics. So we have like an advisory group for wellness, because we know we can't make a mistake there. But when you talk about like design on buses, like, we don't need a committee for that. Like, if we make a mistake, we'll work with the transportation folks and fix it. So it's kind of like knowing where you need that extra oversight. That's not like an approval process. It's really genuinely like, help us understand, and we'll help you understand.
Yeah, great. Well, Ben, this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. We've learned a great deal, and we really appreciate you taking the time to help us understand a bit about your journey and the incredible work that you've been doing. And it's exciting to see the numbers, 65 million page views and 250,000 users. So we're really grateful to you, and we look forward to an opportunity to share with you some of the things that we've been doing at some point. And maybe I'll swing over to OSU, Ohio State, for a visit sometime, and we can have a cup of coffee and follow up. There's like 15 categories of questions that I haven't even begun to
I've generated more questions than I've answered. Yeah. I just say thanks for having me. This was fun. If anybody wants the PowerPoint, I know we didn't go through it too much. We just went through some of it. I shared it with Bradley.
Okay, wonderful.
So he can share it. And then I'm also willing to share one of the Design Lab PowerPoints. If anybody has any interest in that, I can send that to Bradley too. They're harder to share because they're like 100 megs, but I'm sure it would be good to see what it looks like start to finish.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Hope you have a good night.
Yeah, thanks.